Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is lecture 24 in the concept series on art and science. This is a complicated question. There are a lot of different theories about how art and science are related to each other, whether or not they are at all related to each other. And I'm just going to talk about 6 different models. They differ fundamentally on the answers to questions like this. Are art and science incompatible, but still interesting to juxtapose or to mix? Or are art and science fundamentally the same activity? It's just that we don't recognize them as that, and so it's the business of art to bring out the relationship between them. So I'm just going to sample 6 positions that are in between those two more radical positions. First, the idea that art and science are separate. This is associated with the English chemist and novelist C.P. Snow, who invented the expression two cultures, that is science and art. Actually, for him, art meant literature. He was equally serious about his work as a novelist as he was about his work as a chemist. Simon Critchley has pointed out that Snow's argument actually repeats a common theme in English philosophy, and it can be found in 19th century German theory as well. There's a book about that if you're interested. So this idea that there are two cultures and that there is a deep gulf between them has been widely discussed and critiqued, and the phrase remains very common, still in use. Part of his argument turns on what he calls rude questions. There are 2 pairs of these rude questions. This screen has the first pair. So he would go into a gathering of people in the arts, which again for him meant literature, but he's talking about the arts in general, and he would ask people in the room, what is the second law of thermodynamics, which is what's in that schematic representation on the left. And then he would go into a gathering of scientists and say, who wrote Hamlet? So the idea is that these show equivalent amounts of ignorance, because most people in the arts couldn't say what the second law of thermodynamics is, or maybe have a sort of vague idea, but not much of an idea. And according to Snow anyway, a certain number of scientists wouldn't know who wrote Hamlet, but it's a rude question. It's a rude idea, and they're rude questions. It's a rude idea because it seems likely that most scientists would know who wrote Hamlet. But as we know, a lot of people in the arts wouldn't know about the second law of thermodynamics. The notion is that those two are equivalent. The notion that those are equally plausible questions, but one group fails more than the other. This second set of questions is intended to be even ruder. So to a gathering of people in the arts, he says, can you define mass and acceleration? And then to a gathering of scientists, he says, can you read? So his point was that the cultures of art and science have grown so far apart that both sides know only the rudiments of the other, so in effect they can't share informed conversations. There's been a lot of literature about this, about Snow and the two cultures, and it's been said that French post-structuralists, the kind who I've been quoting through this whole series, often couldn't answer questions like, can you define mass and acceleration? A lot of people mix up mass and weight, for example. And there's even a book that where the authors looked around in writers like Derrida and found where they made mistakes that were sort of like mistakes of mass and acceleration. And so Snow says that basically if you don't understand a field at that level, then you really can't carry on more interesting and certainly not more sophisticated conversations. So if you have a scientist who says to you, I really love modernism, but that scientist doesn't know anything about Duchamp, then some things you can definitely say, all sorts of things, but you can't carry on. He can't carry on a really informed, enriched, and mutual kind of conversation. That would be Snow's point of view. Then there's the position that art and science share aesthetics. This is a position that's often voiced by scientists. Against that position, Leo Steinberg, the art historian, has written a really interesting essay called Art and Science, Should They Be Yoked? In 1986. You can get it on JSTOR. It's a report about a conference that he attended, which was mostly scientists, and they were congratulating each other on having so much in common with artists. Quote, at this table, 3 criteria have been proposed to characterize the products of art. an interest in the specific materiality of things, elegance in composition, and the emotion of delight. It seems to me that each is problematic. So the scientists were claiming that art and science shared aesthetic goals. They were interested in materiality, they were interested in elegance, and they were interested in delight. In my experience, it's more common to have scientists say that what bridges art and science is an interest in beauty, but elegance definitely comes up, because elegance is something that is a criterion used in science to describe an excellent formulation of a hypothesis or an equation, that it's succinct, that it's elegant, and then that property is something that supposedly also happens in art. So against the scientists, Steinberg pointed to incidents of vandalism against artworks, and he cited a book called Power of Images by the art historian David Friedberg, which chronicles examples of violence done toward images. That doesn't happen in science, Steinberg pointed out, so that if art and science are to be yoked together, if they're going to be linked in these ways, it's going to have to be by criteria other than elegance or delight. And that is a photograph of Mary Richardson's knife slashes in Velázquez's Rockby Venus from 1914. So there are a number of other aesthetic terms that have been proposed as links between art and science: creativity, wonder, awe, inspiration. That's David Edwards, a scientist at Harvard, who says innovation as a creative process that is neither completely aesthetic nor scientific, but a fusion of the deductive logic of scientific experimentation with the intuitive inspiration of artistic creation is the way forward. So I think if you were to make a list of these terms that have been claimed mostly by scientists as held in common between science and art, I think the most common one would be beauty. Creativity might be the second, and elegance may be the third, but there are all these other ones, including the ones that Steinberg mentioned, materiality and so on. In regard to creativity and wonder and those sorts of words, there is a physiologist, Robert Root Bernstein, who has studied creativity in art. He has, quote, shown that the most successful artists and engineers, compared with the general population, are very engaged with activities that are arts avocations. Their own research practice is fed by their thinking, by their arts thinking and avocations. In other words, artists and scientists share creativity. It's not the kind of thing you can really argue against, and that's because creativity is such a vague word. It's so general, and it seems to apply practically anywhere when somebody invents or creates something. So some of these are difficult to argue against. Other ones, like elegance, have interesting counterexamples, because elegance really doesn't have much to do with slashing of a painting, for example. Steinberg's point is actually, I think, a very good one. Whatever art is, it isn't just elegance and delight and creativity and all those other things. Creativity could be the subject of a completely separate lecture. I would just say that when you hear that word creativity, it's often a good idea to ask exactly what the word means. What work is it being asked to do? What is it asked to explain in any given context? Then there's the idea that art and science can form a third culture. And after Snow, there were attempts to define third cultures, fourth cultures, fifth cultures, and so on. A number of art-science collaborators feel that art and science combine to form a third culture. This is Victoria Vesna, who's an artist who's done a number of art-science collaborations. She's talking about something called noise aquarium.
I've worked with scientists who say that, maybe 20 people read their paper, but hundreds of thousands of people see their artwork and experience it, and maybe a percentage of those people get more involved in environmentalism. I was actually invited to do something with these planktons that were being 3D scanned in Vienna by Alfred Wendel, who's the director of scientific visualization at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. So I was trying to think, how do I frame this beautiful work they're doing, 3D scanning these micro creatures. The idea was to blow them up as large as whales and make them as important as whales and dolphins and these big mammals, and show how the bottom of the food chain is actually influenced by us. What I'm very much...
So Vesna wrote an essay called Toward a Third Culture, Being in Between, in which she reviews C.P. Snow's book, and she concludes that misunderstandings happen when scientists don't work closely with artists and the people they critique, but it is possible to create a third culture if there's enough exchange of information. She says this third culture will emerge, quote, out of triangulation of the arts, sciences, and humanities. And then in another place she says art, science, and technology. I think a lot of people share this hope, and a lot of collaborative projects are based on it. Of course, the question is always what form that third culture will take. Often a visualization like this, even in a completely new setting, is less a matter of a third culture than a representation of one culture by the other culture. A fourth position is that art and science are two cultures out of many, and that they divide among themselves. So Evelina Domnich and Dimitri Jeffland are a pair of artists who live in the Netherlands, and they're unusual among art science people because their practice always engages science at a professional level. They don't just illustrate or represent science, as in that project of Vesna's, but they practice science. And as a result, some of their work has led to new science. That's one of the criteria that has been used to define what interesting art-science collaborations are, that the artist should be able to do something other than just represent what the scientist has done. They should be able to engage with it in such a way that the scientist can look and say, oh, okay, and then go back to the lab and do something else. It should be generative. So their position on this issue is practical. There's no need to think of only 2 or 3 cultures because art and science actually themselves are many different specific practices. They have some really interesting videos online that you can look at. Fifth position is that art and science have some common ground. Molina is a physicist who's interested in art, and like other scientists, he's argued that there are specific areas of common interest and content. So this is kind of like the Venn diagram model. You can see there's a claim that there's an overlap somewhere. It's a question of finding it. He says there are, quote, more shared traits of personality and cognitive strategy than there are differences between artists and scientists. Probably the most prominent version of this claim was written by E.O. Wilson. He's a biologist. He wrote a book called Consilience. This was a kind of a bestseller at the time because it's all about all the arts. This guy's very ambitious. All the arts and all the sciences and all the humanities and how they can think about their common ground. He argues that common property of science and art is the transmission of information, and the respective modes of transmission in science and art can be made logically equivalent. This book was sometimes unfavorably reviewed when it came out because it depends on very abstract ideas like this logical equivalence is a little bit slippery, and consilience turns out to be a really unusual word that he took from the 19th century. So he had to really stretch to make this claim, and he does survey a whole lot of different fields, but it's still the major attempt to find common ground between art and science, because if you feel that there are points of intersection and you work in art and science related topics, then you need to figure out exactly what you think the shape of that shared territory is, and this is one of the best attempts. And 6, art and science can fuse, some people say, to form a kind of hybrid. That hybrid is usually called art science. Sometimes that's called sci-art, art science. Art science is a term popularized by David Edwards in this book. And there's also art/science and art_sci, and so on. The formulas suggest various forms of the claim that these two sides can be fused. So I'll give you an example. Adam Zaretsky is an artist who's made a number of projects that try to fuse science and art. He was a School of the Art Institute student, and he was working with Eduardo Katz. So we have, here's a faculty member who's very prominent in a field called bioart, which is a kind of art-science fusion. Adam's a very eccentric fellow, as you're about to see.
I teach media studies, I teach to a lot of things like video production, but actually my forte is art and science. I'm kind of interested in art and biology, and in fact, I'm one of the top 10 bio artists in the world. There's only 10 of us, so it's not that hard, but I'm in the top 10, and I'm near the bottom. I'm rising. Bioart is a mixture of art and biology, but it's actually art that is alive and subject to some sort of biotechnological interrogation. It's not
Adam's always been eccentric. He was an eccentric back when he was a student. So this is one of his projects where he used a tattoo gun to insert a plasmid called lunatic fringe, which multiplies elements like limbs into pheasant embryos. So he was working in a lab where work on its kind embryology was being done. But instead of using the usual micropipettes and the usual equipment, he used a tattoo gun, which it's not the right thing to do, to insert a plasmid, which he had nicknamed lunatic fringe, because it produces multiple limbs, into pheasant embryos. One embryo that died after this process was buried in what Adam called a Neo-Egyptian mummification ceremony with myrrh, salt, and limestone. It's okay, he says, to have feelings for things like blastulas, which is this early stage embryo that died, because they have, quote, dignity to a certain extent. And they go through, quote, coordinated yogic moves that burrow and fold in. He's talking about the development of the embryo. His practice is often hybrid in this way. He doesn't try to collaborate directly with science. He doesn't illustrate science. He doesn't advance science, but he tries to find new ways of combining its content with art. So there is no single model for how art and science are related. Most of the time, artists who work with scientists don't really understand the science that they engage with, not fully, not to the professional level, so conversations and collaborations are partial, and they're subject to the kind of criticism of C.P. Snow's rude questions. And sometimes artists mainly help scientists visualize their findings, which is a legitimate and important thing to do if the science is something like a science of climate change, and artists can contribute ways of reimagining it. But there are these other purposes for art-science collaboration, which involve different kinds of meanings that would come from something like a hybrid or a third term after art and science and so on. And there are also, as in the case of Evelina Domnich and Dmitry Gelflin, there are collaborations where the art has actually influenced the science and created new work. So then these are actually, you could say, different fields, different subjects. They're not all well described by being called art-science collaborations. So if you get involved in these questions, one thing that it's good to do is to figure out for yourself how you feel art can be related to science and what your relationship to the scientists that you work with is. It's a field that's in flux, and there are many possibilities now that are just not very well understood, not very well documented. So in another 10 or 20 years, this list of 6 may change into something completely different.